Rain hammered the windows of Blackmore Hall as Eleanor Ashworth heard her father's voice rise in the study below, sharp with panic. She stopped on the staircase, one hand pressed to the cold wooden rail, and listened. Something was wrong. Her father never shouted unless he was losing, and he never lost unless the stakes were far too high. She moved down the last few steps quietly, her slippers making no sound on the worn carpet, and stopped just outside the study door. Through the gap where the wood had warped with age, she could see candlelight flickering across a table covered in cards, coins, and crumpled papers. Her father, Baron Charles Ashworth, sat with his shirt collar open and his face pale and damp with sweat. Across from him sat a man Eleanor had never seen before. He was tall, even seated, with dark hair combed back and gray eyes that seemed to take in everything in the room without moving much at all. He wore a coat cut from fine black wool, the kind that spoke of money without needing to say a word about it. He did not fidget the way her father did. He did not sweat. He simply watched the cards and watched her father with the calm patience of a man who already knew how the evening would end. "One more hand," her father said, his voice cracking. "Give me one more hand, your grace, and I will win it all back." The stranger did not answer right away. He set down his cards, folded his hands together, and studied the Baron the way a doctor studies a patient who has already refused good advice too many times. "You have nothing left to wager, Lord Ashworth," he said. His voice was low and even, without any cruelty in it, which somehow made it worse. "You have lost the West Field, the hunting rights, and every shilling in your strong box. I have been patient. I do not think patience is what you need tonight." "There is one more thing," her father said quickly. "One thing you have not yet won." Eleanor felt her heart go still. She did not know what he meant, not fully, but something cold moved through her chest, a warning she could not name. The Duke tilted his head slightly. "And what would that be?" Her father did not answer with words at first. He turned toward the door, toward the very gap where Eleanor stood hidden in shadow, and for one terrible moment she was certain he could see her. Perhaps he could. Perhaps he had known she was listening the entire time. "My daughter," he said. "Eleanor. She is 22, unmarried, and of good family on her mother's side. I offer her hand in marriage against everything I have lost tonight. If you win, the debt is settled and she becomes your wife. If I win, you return everything and we never speak of this again." Silence filled the study. Eleanor's breath caught somewhere in her throat and refused to move. She wanted to burst through the door and scream that she was not a coin to be tossed onto a table, that she was not a horse or a hunting dog to be traded away in a moment of desperation. But her feet would not carry her forward. She stood frozen, listening to her own future being decided by men who had not thought to ask her opinion at all. The Duke rose slowly from his chair. He walked toward the study door, unhurried, and for one heartbeat Eleanor thought he meant to leave, to refuse the wager outright and walk out into the rain rather than take part in something so shameful. Instead, he reached out and pushed the door open fully. Eleanor stood revealed in the doorway, candlelight falling across her face, her hands clenched at her sides. She did not look away from him. She had spent years managing the household accounts while her father drank and gambled, years learning to hold her chin high even when there was nothing left to be proud of. She would not lower her eyes now, not for a stranger who had just heard himself offered a wife like a stake in a card game. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. His gray eyes moved from her face to her clenched hands and back again, and something flickered behind them that Eleanor could not read. It was not amusement. It was not pity either. It looked almost like recognition, as though he had been searching for her without knowing her name. "You heard everything," he said quietly. "It was not a question." "I heard my father offer me as payment for his debts," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady even as her pulse pounded in her ears. "I would ask that you refuse him." A faint sound escaped the Duke, not quite a laugh. "Would you?" he said. "And why is that?" "Because I am not a stake to be won," she said. "Whatever quarrel you have with my father, it is his to answer for, not mine." Her father made a strangled sound of protest from his chair, but the Duke lifted one hand, silencing him without even glancing his way. He kept his eyes on Eleanor. "You are right," he said. You are not his to wager, and yet here we are because he has already spoken the words, and I find myself considering them regardless." Aliner's stomach turned. "Then you would take me like a piece of land." "I would marry you," the Duke said, his voice still calm, still even, which is not the same thing, though I understand why it feels that way tonight. He paused. "My name is Adrian Voss. I hold the title of Duke of Ravenshallow. I did not come to Blackmore Hall tonight to win a wife at cards, Miss Ashworth. I came because your father owed a debt that has grown too large for even his estate to cover. What happens next is, unfortunately, no longer only about you or me." "Then walk away," Aliner said. "Forgive the debt, leave us in peace." Something crossed his face then, quick and gone before she could name it. "I wish I could tell you it was that simple," he said. "It is not." Her father, sensing an opening, straightened in his chair. "One more hand, your grace. Let the cards decide it fairly. If fortune favors me, you keep nothing and my daughter stays where she belongs." The Duke turned back to the table, without answering immediately. He studied the scattered cards, the empty bottle near the Baron's elbow, the trembling of the older man's hands. Aliner watched him think, watched the calculations move behind his composed face, and understood with sudden clarity that this man was not the reckless sort who gambled for pleasure. Everything about him suggested control, patience, a mind that weighed every outcome before acting. Which meant that whatever happened next, he had likely already decided it before he ever sat down at that table. "Very well," the Duke said at last. "One hand, final wager. If you win, Lord Ashworth, every debt is forgiven, and I leave Blackmore Hall tonight and never return. If I win, your daughter marries me within the month, and I will settle every remaining note against this estate so that no other creditor may touch it again." Aliner's breath left her in a rush. "You cannot decide my future in a single hand of cards." "No," the Duke agreed, looking at her again, his gray eyes steady. "But your father already has. I am simply choosing not to let him ruin you further while doing it." There was something strange in the way he said it, something that did not match the cold bargain on the surface. Aliner did not have time to puzzle over it, because her father was already reaching for the deck with shaking hands, shuffling the cards with the desperate energy of a man who believed luck might still save him. The game did not take long. Aliner stood in the doorway and watched every card fall, watched her father's face drain of color as his hand proved weaker than he had hoped, watched the Duke lay down his own cards without triumph or cruelty, simply setting them on the table as a fact that could not be argued with. Her father slumped in his chair, all the fight gone out of him at once. "It is done, then," he whispered. The Duke rose and looked toward Aliner once more. He did not smile. He did not gloat. If anything, he looked almost tired, as though the win had cost him something rather than granted him a prize. "I will return in 3 days with the papers," he said, addressing her father but watching Aliner as he spoke. "Miss Ashworth, I know this is not how any woman imagines her future beginning. I will not pretend otherwise, but I give you my word that no harm will come to you under my protection." Aliner lifted her chin, refusing to let him see how badly her hands were shaking at her sides. "Your word means little to me, your grace. You have just proven that men of title can decide a woman's entire life over a game of cards." Something in his expression shifted again, quicker this time, almost like regret. "Then I shall have to earn your trust the harder way," he said quietly. 3 days, Miss Ashworth." He gathered his coat, bowed briefly to her father, who could not meet his eyes, and walked past Aliner toward the front door. For one moment, as he passed her in the narrow hallway, he paused. "For what it is worth," he said, his voice low enough that her father could not hear, "I did not come here tonight expecting to leave with a wife. I came here for another reason entirely. You will understand soon enough." Before Aliner could ask what he meant, he was gone, out into the rain, his carriage rattling away down the long drive until the sound of it faded into the storm. Aliner stood alone in the hallway, staring at the closed door, her whole future rewritten in the span of a single card game, and she could not shake the feeling that whatever the Duke of Ravenshallow had truly come for that night, it was not the thing he had won. 3 days passed, and Alina spent every hour of them trying to find a way out of the marriage that had been forced upon her. She wrote to her aunt in Bath, asking if she might come and stay, only to receive a short reply saying the household there had no room for another mouth to feed. She considered writing to a solicitor, asking whether a debt wager could be undone in law, but she already knew the answer. Her father had signed papers over the years that gave him little protection and gave his creditors a great deal. Whatever the Duke wanted, he had the law fully on his side. On the morning of the third day, a carriage arrived at Blackmore Hall exactly as promised. Alina watched from her window as the Duke of Ravenshallow stepped down, dressed in dark gray traveling clothes, his manner as composed as it had been the night of the card game. A second man followed him from the carriage, carrying a leather case of papers, and Alina understood at once that this was no social visit. This was business, plain and final. She met them in the drawing room, standing rather than sitting, her hands folded in front of her the way she had trained herself to stand when speaking with difficult tenants or unpaid tradesmen. She had decided, somewhere in the sleepless hours of the previous night, that if this marriage could not be avoided, she would at least walk into it with her eyes open and her voice unafraid. "Your Grace," she said before he could speak first, "before any papers are signed, I would like to understand exactly what you intend." The Duke studied her for a moment, something almost like approval crossing his face. He gestured for the second man to wait outside, and once the door had closed, he took a seat across from her, though she remained standing. "I intend to marry you within the month, as I said," he replied. "I will settle your father's remaining debts in full, which will save this estate and prevent him from facing debtor's prison. Your younger brother's schooling will continue to be paid without interruption. The household staff here will keep their positions and their wages, regardless of what becomes of your father's finances afterward." "And in return," Alina said, "you gain a wife you did not know existed 3 days ago." "In return," the Duke said, "I gain a wife, yes, though I would ask you not to assume I know nothing about you, Miss Ashworth. I know more than you might expect." Alina frowned at that, but he did not explain further, and she chose not to press him yet. There would be time for questions later, she told herself. For now, there were terms to settle, and she intended to settle them carefully. "If I am to marry you," she said, "I will have conditions of my own." "I expected as much," the Duke said, and there was something close to the beginning of a smile at the corner of his mouth, though it vanished quickly. "Go on." "I will not be treated as a possession within your household. I will have my own allowance, separate from any control by you or your staff. I will be permitted to write to my family and receive them at Ravenshallow whenever I choose." "And this marriage," she said, forcing the words out steadily even though her chest tightened as she spoke them, "will be one of name only. I will be your duchess in title and nothing more." The Duke was quiet for a long moment. He did not look offended, nor did he look surprised. He simply considered her words the way he had considered the cards on the table 3 nights before, weighing them with careful, unhurried thought. "Agreed," he said finally, "to all of it." Alina blinked, caught off guard by how easily he accepted terms that most men in his position would have laughed away. "You agree so quickly." "I have no wish to make you more unhappy than circumstances already have," he said. "You did not choose this marriage. I would be a poor sort of man if I made it worse than it needs to be." "And yet you did not refuse the wager when you had the chance," Alina said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "You could have forgiven my father's debt and walked away. You chose not to." Something shifted behind his gray eyes again, that same flicker of something unreadable she had noticed the night of the card game. "There are reasons for that which I am not yet able to share with you," he said. "I ask for your patience, Miss Ashworth. In time, I believe you will understand." "That is not much of an answer." "No," he admitted, "it is not. But it is the truest one I can offer you today." He rose from his chair and walked toward the window, looking out over the overgrown gardens of Blackmore Hall, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. Alina watched him, trying to read something in the set of his shoulders, in the stillness of his posture, but he gave nothing away. "May I ask you something in return?" he said without turning around. "You may ask," Elinor said. "I make no promise to answer." That almost smile returned briefly. "Fair enough. Tell me about your mother." The question startled her so completely that for a moment she could not speak at all. "My mother," she repeated. "She died when I was 16. Why would you ask about her?" The Duke turned back to face her, and for the first time since she had met him, something in his expression looked almost gentle. "Her name was Catherine, was it not?" Elinor's pulse quickened. "How do you know my mother's name?" "I told you," he said quietly, "that I know more than you might expect. I'm not yet ready to explain everything, but I promise you this much, Miss Ashworth. My reasons for entering that card game 3 nights ago had very little to do with your father's debts, and a great deal to do with the past. When the time is right, you will hear the whole of it. Until then, I ask only that you trust me enough to come to Ravenshallow, and see for yourself that I intend you no harm." Elinor wanted to demand more, to insist that he explain himself immediately rather than asking her to wait on his timing, but something in his tone told her that pressing further would gain her nothing tonight. She filed the question away instead, promising herself she would return to it, and turned the conversation back toward the practical matters at hand. "When am I expected to arrive at Ravenshallow?" "After the wedding," he said, "which I propose we hold quietly within the fortnight at the local parish here rather than in London. I imagine you would prefer as little public spectacle as possible, given the circumstances." "You imagine correctly," Elinor said. The thought of London society whispering about the Baron's daughter who had been won in a card game made her stomach turn. Duke nodded, satisfied, and reached for the leather case his companion had left near the door. He withdrew a set of papers, already drafted, and Elinor realized with a small jolt that he had prepared these terms before ever arriving at Blackmore Hall that morning. He had known, somehow, that she would ask for exactly what she asked for. Or perhaps he had simply decided to offer them regardless of what she requested, and had let her believe she had negotiated something that was already hers to have. She read through the papers carefully, checking every line against what he had promised aloud, and found nothing that contradicted his words. Her allowance was generous. Her brother's schooling was secured through university. The household staff at Blackmore Hall were protected by name, and nowhere in the document was there any clause forcing her into a marriage bed she did not want. It was, as far as such arrangements went, remarkably fair. "You had this prepared before you arrived," she said. "I did." "You were confident I would agree to your terms." "I was confident you would negotiate terms of your own, and that mine would satisfy them," he said. "I have found, in my limited dealings with you so far, Miss Ashworth, that you are not a woman who accepts anything without first understanding exactly what it costs her. I respect that. I built these papers with that understanding in mind." Elinor set the papers down on the small table between them and studied him for a long moment. There was something about this man that did not fit the picture she had built of him in her mind over the last 3 sleepless nights. She had imagined him cold, calculating, perhaps even cruel, a nobleman who collected debts and people with the same detached interest. Instead, she found herself facing someone careful and strangely thoughtful, who seemed almost burdened by the position he now held over her life. It did not erase what he had done. He had still accepted a wager that treated her as property, still walked into her family's home, and left with her future folded into his coat pocket. But it complicated the anger she had been carrying, softened its edges just slightly, and Elinor did not entirely trust that softening. She had learned, over years of watching her father's charm win back her mother's forgiveness time after time, that gentle words could hide a great deal. "I will sign," she said finally, "on the condition that you promise me one more thing." "Name it." "When you are ready to tell me why you truly came to Blackmore Hall that night, you will tell me everything, not pieces, not half answers meant to satisfy me for the moment. Everything." The Duke held her gaze, and for a moment Elinor thought she saw something like relief pass through his expression, as though her request matched something he had already decided to do regardless of whether she asked for it. You have my word, he said. Everything when the time comes. Alina picked up the pen his companion had left on the table and signed her name beneath his, her hand steadier than she expected it to be. As the ink dried, she felt the shape of her future shifting once again, no longer the frightened, cornered thing it had been 3 nights ago in the study doorway, but something else entirely. A puzzle, perhaps, with pieces she had not yet been given. A story that had begun long before she was born, tangled somehow with her mother's name, and a debt that seemed to run deeper than money. The Duke gathered the signed papers, tucked them carefully back into the leather case, and rose to take his leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at her one final time. 2 weeks, Miss Ashworth, he said. I will send a carriage for the wedding preparations, and I promise you this. Whatever you come to think of me by the end of this, you will not think I was dishonest with you. He left the same way he had arrived, calm and unhurried, leaving Alina standing alone in the drawing room with a signed marriage contract and more questions than she had begun the day with. Outside, the carriage pulled away down the long gravel drive, and Alina pressed her hand against the cool glass of the window, watching it go, turning her mother's name over and over in her mind, wondering what secret from the past had brought the Duke of Ravenshallow to her father's card table in the first place. The wedding was over before Alina fully understood it had begun. She remembered the cold stone floor of the parish church beneath her slippers, the small handful of witnesses standing in the shadows, and the steady sound of the Duke's voice as he spoke his vows without hesitation. Her own voice had sounded strange to her ears, distant, as though someone else were speaking through her mouth. When it was finished, she was no longer Alina Ashworth. She was the Duchess of Ravenshallow, and within the hour she was seated in a carriage rolling away from everything she had ever known. The journey to Ravenshallow Manor took most of the day, and the Duke said little during it, occupied with letters and papers he read by the dim light coming through the carriage window. Alina watched the countryside change as they traveled, the gentle hills of her childhood giving way to darker forests and steeper roads, until at last the carriage crested a rise and Ravenshallow Manor came into view below them. It was larger than she had imagined, a great sprawling house of dark gray stone with tall windows that caught the last light of the afternoon sun and turned it cold and silver. Rows of chimneys rose against the sky, and beyond the house, thick woods stretched in every direction, as though the manor had been built deliberately far from the reach of neighbors or curious eyes. Alina felt a small shiver pass through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The carriage rolled to a stop in the wide gravel courtyard, and a line of servants stood waiting to receive them, dressed in neat black and gray uniforms, their faces carefully arranged into polite, unreadable expressions. At the front of the line stood an older woman with silver hair pulled back tightly and sharp eyes that moved over Alina with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "This is Mrs. Hargreave," the Duke said as he helped Alina down from the carriage. "She has managed this household for over 20 years. Whatever you need, she will see it done." Mrs. Hargreave curtsied, but her eyes lingered on Alina's face a moment longer than seemed necessary, studying her features as though searching for something she expected to find there. "Welcome to Ravenshallow, Your Grace," she said, her voice polite but carrying an odd weight beneath it. "It has been a long time since this house has had a duchess." There was something in the way she said it, some meaning buried beneath the ordinary words. But before Alina could ask what she meant, Mrs. Hargreave had already turned to direct the other servants toward the carriage and the trunks. Alina was led through the front doors and into a grand entrance hall with a high ceiling and a wide staircase curving upward into shadow. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Voss ancestors staring down with painted eyes, but Alina noticed one section of the hallway, near the base of the stairs, where the paneling looked slightly different from the rest, as though a door had once stood there and been sealed shut. She filed the observation away and said nothing. "You will be given rooms in the east wing," the Duke told her as they climbed the stairs. "I keep to the west wing myself, along with my study and the estate offices. You will find the east wing quieter, and the gardens beneath your windows are, I am told, quite pleasant this time of year." "You are giving me my own separate rooms," Alina said, though it was not truly a question. It matched the terms they had agreed to, and yet hearing it confirmed so plainly still struck her strangely, a reminder of exactly what kind of marriage this was meant to be. "As we discussed," the Duke said simply, and something in his tone told her he did not intend to say more on the matter, not yet. Her rooms, when she reached them, were larger and finer than anything she had known at Blackmore Hall. A wide bed with heavy curtains, a writing desk positioned near tall windows overlooking the gardens, a small sitting room attached with its own fireplace already lit against the coming evening chill. It should have felt like comfort. Instead, it felt like a cage dressed in silk. However unwillingly, the Duke himself might have built it. Over the following days, Elinor settled slowly into the rhythm of Ravenshallow Manor, though rhythm was perhaps too generous a word for it. The Duke was rarely present. He left before she woke most mornings and returned late in the evening if he returned at all, often gone for 2 or 3 days at a stretch on business he never fully explained. When they did share a meal, their conversation remained polite but careful, both of them stepping around the promise he had made her the day the contract was signed. Elinor did not press him. She had learned enough of his manner by now to understand that pushing too hard only made him retreat further behind his composed, unreadable expression. Instead, she turned her attention to the house itself, and to the strange quiet that seemed to live within its walls. The servants were courteous, but guarded, choosing their words with obvious care whenever Elinor asked even simple questions about the manor's history. When she asked one of the younger maids, a girl named Alice, about the sealed section of paneling near the staircase, the girl's face went pale and she suddenly remembered urgent work waiting elsewhere. It was Mrs. Hargreave who unsettled Elinor most of all. The housekeeper was efficient and correct in every duty, yet Elinor often caught her watching from doorways or across rooms, her sharp eyes tracing Elinor's face with an expression that was difficult to name. It was not hostility, exactly. It looked closer to grief or memory, the way a person looks at something that reminds them painfully of someone else. One rainy afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, Elinor found herself alone in the East Wing sitting room, restless and unable to focus on the book in her lap. The rain fell steadily against the windows, and the manor felt unusually still. Most of the staff occupied elsewhere in preparation for a storm rolling in from the coast. She set the book aside and decided, against her better judgment, to explore the parts of the house she had not yet been shown. She made her way down the wide staircase and along the ground floor corridors, past the formal dining room and the Duke's closed study, until she reached the section of paneling near the base of the stairs that had caught her attention on her very first day. Up close, she could see it more clearly now, a seam in the wood where a door had once been, painted over and fitted with matching molding to disguise its presence almost entirely. Almost, but not quite. Elinor pressed her fingers along the edge of the panel until she found a small catch hidden beneath a carved leaf pattern. It gave way with a soft click, and the panel swung inward, revealing a narrow set of stairs leading down into darkness. Her heart beat faster, some part of her aware that she was trespassing into a part of the house that had been deliberately hidden, but curiosity overpowered caution, and she took a candle from a nearby table and stepped through. The stairs led to a long, narrow gallery, lit only by the dim light filtering through small high windows along one wall. Portraits hung along the other wall, older than the ones in the main entrance hall, their frames dusty and neglected. Elinor moved slowly along the row, holding her candle close to each painting, studying faces of Voss ancestors from generations past. Near the end of the gallery, she stopped completely still. The portrait before her showed a young woman with warm brown eyes and dark hair pulled softly back from her face, wearing a green gown and a striking emerald necklace at her throat. Elinor had seen that face before, not in paintings, but in memory, in the faded photographs kept in a drawer at Blackmore Hall, in the mirror of her own reflection on certain mornings when the light fell just right. It was her mother's face. Younger than Elinor had ever known her, painted long before Elinor was born, but unmistakably Catherine Ashworth. Beneath the frame, a small brass plate bore an inscription that made Elinor's breath catch entirely. Catherine Wentworth, betrothed of Ravenshallow, painted the year of her 18th birthday. Wentworth, her mother's maiden name, a fact Eleanor had known her whole life but had never once connected to anything beyond the small, quiet family she had believed her mother came from. Betrothed of Ravenshallow. Not a guest, not a distant acquaintance. Betrothed. Eleanor's hands trembled so badly that hot wax dripped from the candle onto her fingers, the small sting barely registering through the shock spreading through her chest. Her mother had been engaged to marry into this family, this very house, decades before Eleanor was born. And somehow, through circumstances no one had ever explained to her, that engagement had ended, and her mother had married the Baron instead. Footsteps sounded suddenly on the stairs behind her, quick and urgent, and Eleanor spun around, candle raised, to find the Duke standing at the base of the steps, his expression tight with something between alarm and resignation. "You found the gallery," he said quietly. "You knew," Eleanor said, her voice shaking now, no longer from cold or fear but from something closer to anger. "You knew about my mother. This is why you know her name. This is why you came to Blackmore Hall that night. It was never about my father's debts at all, was it?" The Duke stepped further into the gallery, his eyes moving briefly to the portrait behind her before returning to her face. "It is part of the reason, yes," he admitted, "though not the whole of it, and not in the way you might be imagining." "Then tell me," Eleanor said, closing the distance between them, refusing to let him retreat behind careful, unfinished answers any longer. "You promised me everything when the time came. I think the time has come, Your Grace." For a long moment, the Duke said nothing, his gaze moving once more to the portrait of the young woman who would become Eleanor's mother, the woman who had once been promised to this very house and had walked away from it entirely. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost heavy with something that sounded, to Eleanor's surprise, very much like old grief. "My father loved your mother very much," he said. "Or believed he did, in whatever way a man like him was capable of loving anyone. When she broke the engagement and married your father instead, it very nearly destroyed him. He spent the rest of his life believing the Ashworth family had stolen something from him that could never be returned. That belief did not die with him, Eleanor. It became something else entirely, something far more dangerous, and it is the true reason I sat down at that card table 3 nights before our wedding." Eleanor stared at him, the candle trembling slightly in her grip, aware suddenly that whatever answer she had expected, it was not this, and that whatever came next would change everything she believed she understood about the man she had married. Before he could continue, a sudden sharp knock echoed from the top of the hidden stairs, followed by Mrs. Hargreaves' voice, unusually urgent, cutting through the quiet of the gallery. "Your Grace," she called down, breathless. "Forgive the interruption, but there is a rider at the gate. He says it concerns the Baron. He says it is urgent, and that you must come at once." The Duke's expression shifted instantly, the old grief replaced by something sharper, more alert, the look of a man who had been expecting trouble and had just been told it arrived sooner than planned. "We are not finished," he said to Eleanor, already turning toward the stairs. "But I am afraid the rest will have to wait. Something has happened to your father." The rider stood dripping in the front hall, his coat soaked through from the storm outside, his face grim as he handed the Duke a folded letter sealed with wax that had already begun to crack from the wet. Eleanor stood close behind her husband, her heart pounding, watching his face as he broke the seal and read the contents quickly, his jaw tightening with every line. "What has happened?" Eleanor demanded, unable to bear the silence any longer. "Tell me, is my father hurt?" The Duke folded the letter and looked up at her, and for once he did not try to soften what he had to say. "Your father has disappeared from London," he said. "He traveled there 3 days ago without informing anyone at Blackmore Hall, and now the men he owes money to cannot find him either. That is not good news, Eleanor. It means either he is hiding from them or they have already found him first." Eleanor felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet. "You said his debts to you were settled. You said the marriage cleared everything." "It cleared what he owed me," the Duke said grimly. "It did not clear what he owed elsewhere." There are debts your father never mentioned to you, debts I only learned of myself in recent weeks, owed to men who do not forgive a missed payment as easily as I might have." He turned to the rider. "Have the horses saddled. I ride within the hour." "I am coming with you," Alina said immediately. The Duke turned back to her, and for a moment she expected him to refuse outright, to remind her of the terms of their marriage, of her place within this household, of every reason a duchess did not go chasing after debtors in the streets of London. Instead, he studied her face for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, just slightly. "It will not be comfortable," he said, "and it may not be safe." "He is my father," Alina said. "Whatever he has done, whatever foolishness has led him to this, I will not sit here in comfort while his life may be in danger. You cannot ask that of me." "I was not going to," the Duke said quietly. "Pack only what you need. We leave within the hour." The journey to London was long and uncomfortable, the roads made slower by the storm that had followed them from Ravenshallow, and Alina spent much of it staring silently out the carriage window, turning over everything she had learned that day. Her mother's portrait, the broken engagement, the old Duke's grief that had somehow twisted into whatever plan had brought Adrian Voss to her father's card table. And now, hanging over all of it, the sudden and frightening disappearance of her father into a city full of men who wanted something from him that he did not have. They stopped for the night at a coaching inn along the road, a modest but clean establishment where the innkeeper's wife fussed over Alina's damp clothing and brought hot food to their small private room. It was the first time since the wedding that Alina and the Duke had been forced into such close quarters for an extended stretch, and the silence between them, which had felt comfortable enough within the wide halls of Ravenshallow, felt suddenly heavier in the small room, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the steady patter of rain against the shutters. "You said your father loved my mother," Alina said eventually, unable to hold the question back any longer. "But you have not told me what happened between them. Why did she leave him for my father instead?" The Duke was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "I do not know every detail," he admitted. "I was young when it happened, barely old enough to understand what an engagement even meant. What I do know is that my father courted your mother for nearly 2 years before their betrothal was announced. Everyone believed the match a certainty. Then, quite suddenly, your mother broke it off and married Baron Ashworth within a matter of months." "Why?" "My father never said, not clearly," the Duke replied. "He spoke of it rarely and always with bitterness rather than explanation. What I gathered, piecing together fragments over the years, was that your mother came to believe my father was not the man she thought him to be. Something changed her mind, something serious enough that she was willing to walk away from a duke's title and marry a man with far less fortune instead." Alina thought of her mother, gentle and quiet in her memory, a woman who had endured her husband's gambling and drinking with a patience Alina had never fully understood. If Catherine Ashworth had been willing to give up wealth and title for love, it suggested a depth of conviction Alina had never fully credited her with. It also raised an uncomfortable question. "You said your father's bitterness became something dangerous," she said. "What do you mean by that?" The Duke's expression grew heavier. "My father spent years believing the Ashworth family owed him something, a debt of honor he felt had never been repaid. When he died, he left instructions that troubled me for a long time, instructions I did not fully understand until recently. He had been quietly buying up your father's debts for years, Alina, through intermediaries, patiently and carefully, waiting for the day he could collect on all of it at once, and finally settle the score he believed your family owed him." "And you inherited that plan," Alina said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn, cold and unwelcome. "I inherited the debts," the Duke said, "not the plan. When I discovered what my father had done, I intended to simply forgive them, to let the matter rest where it belonged, in the past. But then I discovered something else buried in his papers, something far more troubling than old grief over a broken engagement." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, worn soft at the edges from handling, and passed it across the small table to Alina. She unfolded it carefully and found herself looking at what appeared to be a promissory note, bearing her father's signature and the seal of the Ravenshallow estate, dated several years earlier. "This is a forgery," the Duke said quietly. "My father's seal, yes, but the signature beneath it, the terms written into it, none of it was ever authorized by anyone in my family. Someone created this document, and several others like it, using your father's desperation and my family's name to build a debt that never should have existed, likely intending to collect on it themselves once the confusion grew large enough to hide the truth." Elinor stared at the paper, her mind racing to catch up with what he was telling her. "Someone forged Ravenshallow documents using my father's signature." "Yes," the Duke said, "and whoever did it has been collecting real money from your father for years under the pretense that it was owed to my family. Money my family never received, and never authorized anyone to collect on our behalf." "Then who has been taking it?" "A man named Julian Merrick," the Duke said, and something in his voice turned colder as he spoke the name. "He operates in the shadows of London's financial world, lending money to desperate men, and using forged documents and false claims to disguise the true terms of what he demands in return. I believe he has been extorting your father for years, using these forged notes as leverage, threatening exposure and ruin if your father ever refused to pay." Elinor felt sick. "You knew this before you came to Blackmore Hall, before the card game." "I suspected it," the Duke admitted. "I did not have proof until recently. When I learned your father's true situation, when I understood how deep the trouble ran and how little time remained before Merrick's patience finally ran out, I made a choice. I could not simply forgive a debt that was never truly owed to me in the first place. But I could offer your father a way out that placed you somewhere Merrick could not easily reach. My name carries weight, Elinor, weight that protects. I hoped that marrying you would place you under that protection before whatever was coming for your father arrived." Elinor sat back slowly, the pieces settling into place with a weight that pressed against her chest. The card game had never been about winning a wife for its own sake. It had been a desperate, calculated act of protection, wrapped in a wager because it was the only excuse the Duke had to move quickly enough to pull her out of danger before Merrick's men closed in around her family entirely. "Why did you not simply tell me this from the beginning?" she asked, her voice quieter now, some of her anger draining away and leaving something more complicated in its place. "Because I did not yet have proof strong enough to act on," the Duke said. "And because telling you half a truth, that your family had been the victim of fraud without being able to show you how or by whom, would have frightened you without giving you any way to protect yourself. I intended to gather everything first, and then bring it to you complete as I promised. I did not expect your father to disappear before I had the chance." The rain continued to fall outside, steady and relentless, and Elinor sat with the forged document still in her hands, studying her father's signature copied so carefully onto a page that had nothing honest about it. Whatever anger she still carried toward the Duke for the manner of their marriage had shifted now, tangled together with a new and sharper fear for her father's safety, and a growing understanding that the danger circling her family ran far deeper than she had ever imagined. "We have to find him," she said, "before Merrick does." "That is exactly why we ride at first light," the Duke said, "and Elinor." He waited until she looked up at him again. "Whatever comes next, whatever we find in London, I do not intend to let harm come to you or to your father. That much I can promise, and this time I intend to prove it, not merely say it." Elinor held his gaze across the small table, the firelight flickering between them, and for the first time since the night of the card game, she found herself wanting, however cautiously, to believe him. London greeted them with gray skies and narrow streets crowded with carts, vendors, and the constant noise of a city that never seemed to rest. Elinor had visited the capital only twice before in her life, both times as a girl accompanying her mother to visit distant relatives, and she remembered little of it beyond wide shop windows and the smell of coal smoke. Now, riding through those same streets beside the Duke, searching for a father who had vanished into danger, the city felt entirely different, sharper somehow, full of shadows that seemed to hide more than they revealed. Their first stop was a townhouse near St. James Square, a modest but respectable address that the Duke explained belonged to an old friend of his, a barrister named Edmund Sinclair, who had helped him gather information about Julian Merrick over the past several weeks. Edmund greeted them at the door himself, a lean man with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, and led them quickly into his study, where papers covered nearly every surface. "I have been asking after your father since your letter arrived yesterday," Edmund said, addressing Alina directly, which she appreciated more than she expected to. "He was seen 3 nights ago at a gaming house near the docks, the kind of place respectable men do not usually admit to visiting. After that, nothing. No one has seen him since." "A gaming house," Alina repeated, her stomach twisting. Of course. Even with everything at stake, even with his family's future hanging by a thread, her father had gone looking for cards. "It is possible he went there searching for a way to raise money quickly," Edmund said, not unkindly. "Desperate men often make desperate choices. Unfortunately, that particular establishment is known to be connected to Merrick's operations. If your father owed money there as well, and could not pay, it would explain why he has not been seen since." The Duke's expression darkened. "Do you know where Merrick conducts his business, his true business, not the public face of it?" Edmund hesitated, glancing briefly at Alina before answering. "There is a warehouse near the river, close to the docks where the gaming house sits. I have heard whispers that men who fall too deeply into debt with Merrick are sometimes taken there, held until family or friends arrange payment, or until Merrick decides they are no longer worth the trouble of holding." Alina's blood went cold at the implication buried in those final words, but she forced herself to remain steady, refusing to let fear paralyze her when her father might still need her clear thinking more than her tears. "Then that is where we begin," she said. The Duke turned to her sharply. "Alina, if your father is being held there, the men guarding him will not be gentle, and they will not welcome visitors. I cannot allow you to walk into that warehouse unprotected." "I have no intention of walking in unprotected," Alina said. "But I will not sit in a townhouse drinking tea while my father's life hangs in the balance either. You promised me honesty and partnership when this began, Your Grace. I intend to hold you to it." Something passed between them then, a silent understanding that surprised Alina with how easily it settled into place. The Duke did not argue further. Instead, he turned back to Edmund and began discussing practical matters: how many men could be trusted to accompany them, what hour would offer the best chance of finding the warehouse quiet enough to approach safely, what they might use as leverage if Merrick proved unwilling to simply hand the Baron over. They spent the remainder of the day gathering what information they could. Alina, restless and unwilling to sit idle, offered to review the forged promissory notes Edmund had collected, comparing them against genuine Ravenshallow documents the Duke had brought from the estate archives. It was slow, careful work, the kind of task Alina had grown skilled at over years of managing her father's chaotic household accounts, and she found a strange comfort in losing herself in the details rather than dwelling on her fears. It was well past midnight, the townhouse quiet except for the low crackle of the study fire, when Alina noticed something odd in the paper itself. She held 2 documents up toward the candlelight, one genuine, taken from the Ravenshallow archives years before Alina was born, and one of the forged notes bearing her father's signature. "Adrian," she said, using his given name for the first time without quite realizing she had done so, "look at this." He crossed the room quickly and leaned over her shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her, though neither of them remarked on it. "The paper," Alina said, tilting the forged document toward the light. "Look at the watermark here in the corner. It is different from the genuine note." The Duke studied it closely, his brow furrowing. "I do not see it." "The genuine note carries the mark of the paper mill that has supplied Ravenshallow for generations, the one with the small oak leaf pressed into the corner," Alina explained, setting the 2 documents side by side. "This forged note has no oak leaf at all. It has a different mark entirely, one I do not recognize, and it is dated 3 years earlier than the mill began using this particular style of paper. The Duke went very still, studying the documents with new intensity. You are certain of this? I managed my father's correspondence and accounts for years, Eleanor said. I know every paper mark our family's business ever used because I was the one paying the bills for it. This forged note claims to be dated years before the paper it is written on ever existed. It is proof, Adrian. Real proof that these documents are false, proof that could be shown to any magistrate willing to examine it properly. The Duke sat back slowly, something shifting behind his gray eyes, a spark of hope that had not been there moments before. If we can prove the forgery conclusively, we do not merely rescue your father from Merrick's grasp. We can have the man arrested for fraud outright and end this threat to your family permanently, rather than simply buying our way out of it once more. Eleanor felt a small, fierce satisfaction settle into her chest, the first genuine relief she had felt since the writer arrived at Ravenshallow with news of her father's disappearance. Then, we do not simply rescue him tomorrow night, she said. We bring the proof with us. We make certain Merrick understands exactly what we hold against him before we ever ask him to release my father. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something like admiration settling across his composed features. You continue to surprise me, Eleanor. I have spent my whole life being underestimated by men who assumed a woman's mind was suited only for needlework and polite conversation, Eleanor said. I find I rather enjoy proving them wrong. A faint smile touched his mouth then, real and unguarded, different from the careful, measured expressions she had grown used to since their wedding. I do not underestimate you, he said quietly. I have not, I think, since the night you stood in that doorway at Blackmore Hall and told me plainly that I ought to refuse your father's wager. Eleanor felt warmth rise in her cheeks, unexpected and unwelcome given the seriousness of their situation, and she busied herself gathering the documents together rather than examine too closely what that warmth might mean. They spent the following day finalizing their plan with Edmund's help, arranging for a magistrate they trusted to be available on short notice, and gathering enough evidence to make their case undeniable. The Duke sent word through careful channels that he wished to meet with Merrick directly, framing it as a negotiation over an outstanding debt rather than a rescue attempt, hoping to draw the man into a meeting on their terms rather than forcing a confrontation at the warehouse itself, where the danger to the Baron would be far greater. Merrick agreed to the meeting, as the Duke had suspected he would. A man like Merrick, accustomed to holding power over desperate debtors, would not easily resist the chance to negotiate directly with a duke, particularly one whose family name he had spent years quietly exploiting through forged documents. It fed exactly the kind of ambition Edmund believed drove the man, the desire to see himself as an equal to the nobility whose names he borrowed and abused. The meeting was arranged for the following evening, at a private room above a respectable coffeehouse near the financial district, neutral ground chosen carefully by Edmund to avoid drawing suspicion. Eleanor insisted on attending, and after a brief, quiet argument in the townhouse study, the Duke finally agreed, though he made her promise to remain silent unless directly addressed, and to stay close to Edmund throughout the meeting in case anything went wrong. As evening approached and the hour of the meeting drew near, Eleanor found herself standing in the small guest room Edmund had provided, staring at her reflection in the mirror, trying to steady the nervous energy building in her chest. A soft knock sounded at the door, and she turned to find the Duke standing there, dressed in dark formal clothes, his expression more serious than she had yet seen it. You do not have to come tonight, he said. I would understand if the danger felt like too much. I have come this far, Eleanor said. I will not stop now, not when we are so close to bringing my father home safely. The Duke nodded slowly, though something in his eyes suggested he had expected exactly that answer and had asked only out of genuine concern rather than any real hope of changing her mind. Then stay close to me tonight, he said. Whatever happens in that room, I will not let harm come to you. I promised you that once already, and I intend to keep every promise I make to you from this point forward. Aliner met his gaze steadily, feeling the weight of everything that had passed between them since the night of the card game, the anger and fear and slow, cautious trust that had grown despite everything. "I believe you," she said quietly, and found to her own surprise that she meant it entirely. Together they left the townhouse and stepped into the carriage waiting outside, the city growing dark around them as they made their way toward the coffee house and the confrontation that awaited within, carrying with them the proof that could finally end the danger hanging over her family, and hoping desperately that it would be enough. The room above the coffee house was small and dimly lit, furnished with a single long table and a handful of chairs, the kind of neutral space where businessmen often settled quiet disagreements away from public eyes. Julian Merrick was already seated when Aliner, the Duke, and Edmund arrived, flanked by two large men who stood near the door with the careful stillness of hired muscle rather than clerks or associates. Merrick himself was smaller than Aliner had expected, neatly dressed, with pale eyes that moved over each of them in turn, quick and calculating. He rose politely as they entered, offering a slight bow toward the Duke, though his eyes lingered on Aliner with an interest that made her skin crawl. "Your Grace," Merrick said smoothly, "and the new Duchess, I presume. Word travels quickly in London society. I confess I did not expect you to bring your wife to a business discussion." "This concerns her family directly," the Duke said, his voice cool and controlled. "I saw no reason to exclude her." "Of course," Merrick said, gesturing for them to sit. "Shall we discuss the matter of the Baron then? I understand you are eager to locate him." "We know exactly where he is," the Duke said, "and we know exactly what you have been doing to him for years. I am not here to negotiate a ransom for a man you have already extorted through forged documents bearing my family's name. I am here to inform you that your operation is finished." Merrick's polite expression flickered just slightly before settling back into place. "Forged documents. That is a serious accusation, Your Grace, and one I would think carefully before repeating in front of witnesses." Edmund stepped forward and placed the documents on the table between them, spreading them out carefully so the mismatched paper marks were clearly visible. "We have already had these examined," Edmund said. "The paper used for these so-called Ravenshallow notes was not manufactured until 3 years after the dates written upon them. It is a simple matter to prove in front of any magistrate, and we have one waiting nearby who is more than willing to review the evidence tonight." For the first time since they had entered the room, Merrick's composure cracked entirely. His pale eyes darted toward the documents, then toward the two men standing near the door, and Aliner felt the atmosphere in the room shift, the careful business tone dissolving into something far more dangerous. "I see," Merrick said slowly, his voice losing its earlier smoothness. "It seems this meeting was never truly about negotiation at all." "It was an opportunity," the Duke said. "One I am still willing to extend, if you release the Baron unharmed tonight and agree to answer for your crimes before the courts, rather than forcing this to become uglier than it needs to be." Merrick's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "You misunderstand the position you are in, Your Grace. You believe you hold the advantage because you have found a flaw in my paper, but I still hold the Baron, and I suspect neither you nor your lovely wife would care to see what happens to him if this meeting does not end to my satisfaction." Aliner's heart lurched, fear spiking sharp and immediate through her chest, but she forced herself to stay still, remembering the promise she had made to remain quiet unless addressed. Beside her, the Duke did not flinch. "You are bluffing," he said evenly. "You have spent years building a careful, quiet operation precisely because you have no interest in the kind of attention that violence brings. Harming the Baron now would not save you from the evidence already sitting on this table. It would only ensure you hang for it instead of simply facing prison." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Aliner watched Merrick's face carefully, watched the calculation happening behind his pale eyes, and understood that whatever he decided in the next few seconds would determine everything that followed. Then Merrick's expression shifted into something colder, more decisive, and he gave a small signal toward the men by the door. "Take them," he said quietly. All three. The room erupted into sudden motion. Edmund lunged for the documents on the table, trying to sweep them into his coat before the guards could reach him, while the Duke stepped quickly in front of Alina, putting himself between her and the approaching men. One of the guards reached for Alina's arm, and the Duke moved fast, catching the man's wrist and twisting it away before it could close around her. In the chaos that followed, a struggle broke out near the door, chairs overturning, the small table crashing to the floor as Merrick shouted orders that were quickly lost in the confusion. Alina pressed herself against the wall as instructed, her heart pounding, watching helplessly as the Duke fought to keep the guards from reaching either her or Edmund, his composed calm replaced entirely by fierce, focused determination. One of the guards managed to strike the Duke hard across the shoulder before Edmund pulled the man back, giving the Duke enough space to recover his footing. Alina saw a flash of something metal in the second guard's hand and felt her breath stop entirely, terror rising sharp and immediate as the man lunged toward the Duke. "Adrian," she cried out, unable to stop herself. The warning gave him just enough time to turn, avoiding the worst of the strike, though the blade caught his arm as he twisted away, tearing through his coat sleeve. He staggered but did not fall, and in the same instant Edmund finally freed himself from the first guard and drove his fist hard into the man's jaw, sending him stumbling backward into the overturned table. The commotion had grown loud enough to draw attention from below, and within moments the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs signaled the arrival of men Edmund had stationed outside as a precaution, along with the magistrate he had arranged to have waiting nearby. Merrick, seeing his advantage collapsing rapidly around him, made a desperate move toward the door, but the newly arrived men blocked his path before he could reach it. In the sudden crowd of bodies and shouting voices, Alina pushed forward, ignoring Edmund's attempt to hold her back, and reached the Duke's side just as he pressed a hand against the torn fabric of his sleeve, blood beginning to seep through where the blade had caught him. "You are hurt," she said, her voice unsteady despite her best efforts to remain calm. "It is not deep," the Duke said, though the tightness in his voice suggested otherwise. "Alina, stay back, it is not yet finished." She did not stay back. She tore a strip from her own shawl and pressed it firmly against the wound, applying pressure the way she had once learned tending to injured farmhands at Blackmore Hall, refusing to leave his side even as the magistrate's men moved through the room, securing Merrick and his remaining guard under arrest. Merrick struggled briefly against the men holding him, his earlier composure entirely gone now, replaced by open fury. "This changes nothing," he snarled toward the Duke. "The Baron is still exactly where I left him. Arrest me if you wish, Your Grace, but you will not find your father-in-law before it is too late." The Duke's expression turned to ice despite the pain evident on his face. "Where is he?" Merrick only smiled, a cold, satisfied thing, clearly enjoying the small measure of power he still believed he held even as the magistrate's men pulled him toward the door. Edmund stepped forward quickly. "We already suspected the warehouse near the docks," he said. "If Merrick is confident enough to taunt us rather than bargain, it likely means the Baron is still there, under guard, waiting for orders that will now never come." The Duke straightened despite his injury, determination overtaking whatever pain he felt. "Then we go now, before whoever is guarding him learns what has happened here tonight, and decides to act on their own." "You are wounded," Alina said, gripping his good arm. "You cannot simply ignore that." "I can rest once your father is safe," the Duke said, his gray eyes meeting hers with a fierce, steady resolve that left no room for argument. "I did not come this far to stop now, Alina, not when we are this close." Alina looked at him for a long moment, torn between fear for his injury and desperate urgency for her father's safety, and finally nodded, understanding there was no version of tonight where either of them would choose to wait. "Then we go together," she said. "As we agreed from the beginning." Edmund arranged quickly for two of the magistrate's men to accompany them, along with a physician summoned to tend the Duke's wound well enough to allow him to travel safely. Within the hour, their small group set out through the darkened streets of London toward the docks, the fear of what they might find at the warehouse pressing heavily against Aliner's chest with every turn of the carriage wheels, praying they would not arrive too late. The warehouse stood dark and silent near the edge of the river, its windows shuttered, only a faint line of lamplight visible beneath one of the side doors. The Duke's carriage stopped a short distance away, close enough to approach on foot without announcing their arrival, and Aliner stepped down into the cold night air with her heart hammering against her ribs. "Stay close to Edmund," the Duke said quietly, his injured arm still bound tightly beneath his coat, his face pale but set with determination. "The magistrate's men will go ahead of us. If there is any sign of true danger, you retreat to the carriage immediately. I need your word on that, Aliner." "You have it," Aliner said, though she privately doubted her own ability to keep such a promise if her father's life depended on it. The two men Edmund had brought moved ahead carefully, circling toward the side door where the lamplight showed, while the Duke and Aliner followed at a distance with Edmund close beside them. The night was quiet except for the soft lapping of the river against the docks and the distant creak of moored ships shifting in the current. Aliner strained her ears for any sound from within the warehouse, any indication of what waited beyond its walls, but heard nothing beyond her own rapid heartbeat. One of the magistrate's men reached the side door first and tested it carefully, finding it unlocked, likely left so by guards who had not expected trouble to arrive so quickly after Merrick's meeting. He signaled back toward the Duke, and together the small group slipped inside, moving through a narrow storage passage lined with crates and barrels, following the faint light toward a room at the rear of the building. Voices reached them before they arrived, low and irritated, two men discussing something in tones that suggested boredom rather than alarm. Through a gap in a half-open door, Aliner caught sight of her father at last, seated on a low wooden crate, his hands bound loosely in front of him, his clothing rumpled and his face drawn with exhaustion, but alive. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that she nearly cried out before Edmund's firm hand on her arm reminded her to stay silent. The magistrate's men moved quickly and efficiently, catching the two guards entirely by surprise before either could reach for a weapon or raise an alarm. Within moments, both men were subdued and bound in turn, and the Duke stepped into the room, his composed authority returning despite his injury, directing the situation with the same calm precision Aliner had come to associate with him. "Aliner," her father said hoarsely, his eyes finding her across the room, disbelief and shame mingling openly on his face. "You should not be here. This is no place for you." Aliner crossed the room quickly and knelt beside him, working at the ropes binding his wrists with hands that trembled only slightly now that the worst of her fear had passed. "I would not have stayed away," she said. "Not when your life was in danger. Whatever foolishness brought you here, father, you are still my father, and I would not abandon you to men like these." Her father's eyes filled with tears he made no effort to hide, an unfamiliar sight that struck Aliner deeply despite everything. "I have failed you at every turn," he said quietly. "I wagered your future away at a card table, and then I ran straight into worse trouble the very first chance I had, chasing after a fortune I never deserved in the first place. You deserve a far better father than the one you have been given." "We will speak of all that later," Aliner said, freeing his hands at last and helping him rise unsteadily to his feet. "For now, let us simply get you home safely." The Duke approached them as the magistrate's men led the captured guards away, his expression softening slightly as he looked between Aliner and her father. "Lord Ashworth," he said, "I am glad to see you unharmed." Her father's face flushed with a complicated mixture of gratitude and lingering shame as he faced the man he had once treated so carelessly across a card table. "Your Grace," he said, his voice unsteady, "I do not know how to thank you for this, nor how to apologize for the position my foolishness placed your household in. You had every reason to leave me to face the consequences of my own choices, and instead you have risked your own safety to see me freed." "I did not do it for you, Lord Ashworth," the Duke said, not unkindly, though his words carried a firmness that left no room for misunderstanding. "I did it for Aliner, and because the debt Merrick used against you was never truly owed in the first place. That is a matter of correcting a wrong done to my family's name as much as protecting yours. Whatever gratitude you feel, I would ask you to direct it toward becoming a father worthy of the daughter who refused to abandon you tonight, rather than toward me." Her father absorbed the words silently, his eyes moving to Alina with something that looked, for the first time in years, like genuine humility rather than practiced charm meant to smooth over his failures. "I intend to try," he said quietly. "Whatever that is worth, after everything, I intend to try." They made their way back out through the warehouse and into the waiting carriages, the magistrate's men escorting Merrick and his captured associates separately toward the city jail, while Edmund arranged for a physician to examine both the Duke's wound and the Baron's condition. Once they returned to the townhouse near St. James Square. The journey back through the dark London streets felt entirely different from the tense ride toward the warehouse only an hour before, the fear that had gripped Alina's chest finally beginning to loosen its hold. Once they arrived and her father had been settled into a guest room with food and rest finally within his reach, Alina found herself standing outside the study where the physician was tending to the Duke's wound, listening to the low murmur of voices through the door. When the physician finally emerged, assuring her that the cut, while painful, would heal cleanly with proper rest, Alina stepped inside to find the Duke seated near the fire, his sleeve rolled back and a fresh bandage wrapped carefully around his forearm. "You should be resting," she said, moving to sit across from him. "I intend to," he said, though he made no move to rise. "I wanted to see you first to be certain you were truly unharmed after everything tonight." "I am fine," Alina said. "Frightened still, if I am honest, but fine. You are the one who was injured protecting Edmund and myself." "It was a small price," the Duke said, "for keeping you both safe." He paused, studying her in the firelight, something thoughtful and open in his expression that Alina had not seen from him before, not even during their quiet conversation at the coaching inn. "You were remarkable tonight, Alina. The paper marks the courage to stand your ground in that room, the steadiness with which you tended my arm afterward. I do not think I have properly told you how much I admire that in you." Alina felt warmth rise in her cheeks again, more pronounced this time, and she found she did not entirely mind it. "I only did what needed doing," she said. "As did you." "Perhaps," the Duke said. "But there is a difference between doing what needs doing out of obligation, and doing it because the person beside you has become someone you could not bear to see harmed." He held her gaze steadily, and Alina felt something shift between them, quiet and significant, the careful distance they had maintained since their wedding day beginning, at last, to dissolve entirely. "Adrian," she said softly, using his given name again, deliberately this time. "When this began, I told you our marriage would be one of name only." "You did," he agreed, his voice equally soft. "I find," Alina said, choosing her words carefully, "that I am no longer entirely certain that is still what I want." The Duke rose slowly from his chair and crossed the small distance between them, his uninjured hand reaching to gently cover hers where it rested on the arm of her chair. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "we might discover together what we do want instead, now that the danger has finally passed and we have nothing left standing between us but the truth." Outside, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to touch the London sky, the long, dangerous night finally drawing to its close, and Alina sat quietly beside the man she had once believed had stolen her future at a card table, understanding now, with a clarity that settled warm and certain in her chest, that he had instead given her something far more valuable than she ever could have imagined that stormy night at Blackmore Hall. Spring came early to Ravenshallow that year, the gardens beneath Alina's windows filling with color long before the last frost had properly cleared, and she found herself standing at those same windows most mornings now, no longer looking out at the grounds as a stranger might, but as someone who had come, slowly and honestly, to call this place home. The weeks following their return from London had passed in a blur of recovery and quiet change. The Duke's wound healed cleanly, as the physician had promised, though he carried a faint scar along his forearm that Alina sometimes traced with gentle fingers when they sat together in the evenings, a reminder of the night everything between them had finally shifted into something honest. Julian Merrick stood trial for fraud and extortion before the summer began. The forged documents Alina had identified serving as the clearest evidence against him. And he was sentenced to transportation. His careful, quiet operation dismantled entirely by the very proof she had noticed in the candlelight of Edmund's study. Her father remained changed as well, in ways Alina watched with cautious but growing hope. He had returned to Blackmore Hall humbled by everything that had nearly cost him his life, and rather than allowing him simply to resume his old habits, the Duke had offered him something Alina had not expected: stewardship over a small tenant farm on the edge of the Ravenshallow estate, land he would need to manage responsibly, with real consequences if he failed to do so. It was not forgiveness handed freely, but a chance to earn something back through patient, honest work, and to Alina's quiet astonishment, her father had accepted it without complaint, throwing himself into learning the business of the land with an effort she had never once seen him apply to anything in his life before. "You look troubled," the Duke said one evening, finding her in the sitting room with a letter from her father open in her lap, detailing his progress with the spring planting in careful, earnest handwriting that seemed almost unfamiliar coming from him. "Not troubled," Alina said, setting the letter aside as he settled into the chair beside hers. "Only surprised still by how much a person can change when given a real reason to." "People rarely change simply because they are told to," the Duke said. "They change when someone finally shows them what they stand to lose and gives them something worth working toward instead." He reached over and took her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them over the past months, no longer careful or hesitant the way it once had been. "I would like to think I understand that better now than I did the night I sat down at your father's card table." Alina smiled, though it came with a small measure of the old ache that memory still carried. "You very nearly ruined everything that night, you know, marching into a man's home, wagering for his daughter as though I were a horse to be won." "I did," the Duke admitted. "It remains the most reckless decision I have ever made, and I have never once regretted it, though I understand that says little in my favor as a man of sound judgment." "It says a great deal in your favor, actually," Alina said softly. "You were trying to save me, however clumsily you went about it. I did not understand that then. I understand it now." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling gently in the hearth, before the Duke spoke again, his voice carrying a note of quiet significance that drew Alina's full attention. "There is something I would like to show you," he said, rising and offering his hand to help her from her chair. "I have been waiting for the right moment, and I believe tonight is finally it." He led her down through the manor, past the grand staircase, and the entrance hall lined with portraits, until they reached the section of paneling near the base of the stairs that concealed the hidden gallery below. Alina had not returned to that room since the night everything had changed between them, the night the rider had arrived with news of her father's disappearance. But she followed the Duke down the narrow stairs without hesitation now, trusting him completely in a way she never could have imagined during those first uncertain weeks of their marriage. The gallery had changed since she last saw it. New candles burned steadily in freshly polished sconces along the walls, and the portraits themselves had been carefully cleaned and restored, no longer neglected in shadow, but displayed with the same care given to the family portraits upstairs. At the center of it all hung the painting of her mother, Catherine, radiant in her green gown, the emerald necklace catching the candlelight exactly as it must have all those years ago when the portrait was first painted. "I had the gallery restored," the Duke said. "It seemed wrong, somehow, to leave her hidden away in the dark any longer, given everything her memory eventually brought us to." Alina stepped closer to the portrait, studying her mother's young, hopeful face, imagining for the first time not a woman trapped by circumstance, but a woman who had made a brave and difficult choice, walking away from wealth and title because something in her heart told her it was not where true happiness waited. "I used to wonder," Alina said quietly, "whether she ever regretted leaving this life behind, whether some part of her wished she had married your father instead and lived the comfortable existence that would have come with it." "I do not believe she regretted it," the Duke said. Not if the woman Edmund and I have come to know through you these past months bears any resemblance to her mother's character. A woman who chooses love and honesty over comfort and title is not the sort who spends her life wishing she had chosen differently. He reached into his coat then and withdrew a small, worn box, opening it to reveal a delicate golden ring set with a single emerald, unmistakably matching the necklace in the portrait above them. "This belonged to your mother," he said. "My father kept it among his things after the engagement ended, unable to part with it even in his bitterness. I found it among his papers when I was searching for the truth about Merrick's forgeries, and I have been waiting for the right moment to give it back to the family. It always belonged to." Alina stared at the ring, emotion rising in her throat too full for words for a long moment. "Adrian," she finally managed, "this is far more than a piece of jewelry to you, isn't it?" "It is," he said quietly. "It represents everything my family lost through pride and bitterness, and everything I hope we might build instead in its place." He knelt slightly, taking her hand gently in his gray eyes steady and open in a way she had rarely seen since the night of the card game. "Alina, I did not marry you out of love, not at first. I married you out of desperation and duty, believing it the only way to protect you from a danger I did not yet fully understand myself. But somewhere between that stormy night at Blackmore Hall and this quiet evening in my father's hidden gallery, what began as protection became something I did not expect and could not have planned for. I love you, Alina, not as the woman I won at a card table, but as the woman who chose, every single day since, to stand beside me freely, out of nothing but her own will." Alina felt tears gather in her eyes, warm and unashamed, as she looked down at the man who had once been a stranger delivering devastating news in her father's study, and who now knelt before her offering not obligation, but genuine, hard-won love. "I did not expect to love you either," she admitted softly. "I spent so many weeks certain I never could, certain that whatever grew between us would remain nothing more than careful courtesy. I was wrong, Adrian. I have been wrong for some time now, and I am glad, finally, to admit it plainly." He slid the ring gently onto her finger, and Alina felt the weight of it settle there, not as a symbol of ownership or wager, but as a promise freely given and freely accepted, two very different things she had once believed impossible to reconcile within the same marriage. They remained in the gallery a while longer, standing together beneath the portrait of the mother whose long-ago choice had, in its own strange and winding way, brought them both to this moment, before finally climbing the narrow stairs back up into the warm, lit halls of Ravenshallow together. Months later, when the manor hosted its first grand ball since the old duke's passing, Alina and Adrian sat together at a card table set up for the evening's entertainment, playing a friendly hand among laughing guests who knew nothing of the storm that had once brought them together. When Alina won that final hand, laughing as she gathered her small winnings amid the delighted protests of the other players, Adrian watched her with quiet, open affection, remembering another card table, another night, and understanding at last that whatever he had won that stormy evening at Blackmore Hall, it had been nothing compared to everything Alina herself had chosen, freely and completely, to give him in return. 2 years passed at Ravenshallow, and the manor that had once felt like a house of shadows and locked doors had grown, quietly and steadily, into something entirely different. Alina often thought back to her first arrival there, the cold silence of the halls, the sealed gallery hidden beneath the staircase, and marveled at how completely a place could change once the people living within it stopped guarding their secrets from one another. The estate itself had prospered under careful management. Adrian had expanded his shipping interests along the southern coast, working closely now with Edmund Sinclair, whose sharp legal mind had proven invaluable in cutting through the tangled remains of old contracts and debts left behind by his father's bitterness. Together they had traced and settled every remaining forged note connected to Julian Merrick's scheme, returning small sums of stolen money to farmers and tradesmen across 3 counties who had never known the truth of what had been taken from them. Alina had taken to managing much of Ravenshallow's household accounts herself, a task she approached with the same careful precision she had once applied to Blackmore Hall's chaotic finances, except now with resources enough to do real good rather than simply keep disaster at bay. She established a small school in the village nearest the estate, insisting that both boys and girls from tenant families be given the chance to learn their letters and sums, a project Adrian supported without hesitation, remembering perhaps how much his own understanding of the world had been shaped by his father's narrow, bitter view of it, and wishing something different for the children growing up under his protection now. Her father visited twice each season, and Alina watched with quiet, steady pride as the small tenant farm he managed grew more prosperous with each passing year. He had given up cards entirely, a change Alina had not fully believed possible until she watched him decline, without hesitation, an invitation to a friendly game during one autumn visit, choosing instead to walk the fields with his young grandson perched happily on his shoulders. That grandson, a bright-eyed boy named Edward who had inherited his father's calm gray eyes and his mother's stubborn determination, had arrived the previous spring, filling the halls of Ravenshallow with a kind of joyful noise the old stone manor had not known in generations. Alina often found Adrian standing outside the nursery in the quiet hours of early evening, watching their son sleep with an expression of such open tenderness that it still, even after 2 years of marriage, caught unexpectedly at her heart. Mrs. Hargreave, who had once watched Alina with such careful, unreadable eyes during those first uncertain weeks, had long since become something close to family herself, doting on young Edward with a fierce devotion that surprised everyone but Alina, who had come to understand, in time, exactly why the housekeeper's gaze had lingered so strangely on her face that very first day. Mrs. Hargreave had served the old Duke for decades, had watched his bitterness curdle year after year, and had recognized in Alina's arrival the shape of an old sorrow finally beginning to heal. It was on a quiet evening in early summer, roses climbing thick along the garden walls beneath the nursery windows, that Alina found herself once again in the hidden gallery beneath the staircase, standing before her mother's portrait with young Edward balanced on her hip, his small fingers reaching curiously toward the painted emerald at the portrait's throat. "That was your grandmother," Alina told him softly, though he was far too young yet to understand the words. "She was very brave and very wise, and because of her, your father and I found each other, even though neither of us understood it at the time." Adrian's footsteps sounded on the stairs behind her, familiar now in a way that no longer sent a jolt of uncertainty through her chest, but instead brought a warm, settled comfort she had come to depend on. He crossed the gallery and slipped an arm around her waist, looking up at the portrait alongside her. "Do you ever wonder," he asked quietly, "what your mother would think of all this? Of us, of Edward, of everything that grew from a wager neither of us wanted?" "I think," Alina said, leaning into him, "that she would be glad the old bitterness finally found its way to something better. She gave up a great deal to choose love over comfort, and I like to believe that somewhere, she knows her daughter eventually found both." They stood together a while longer in the quiet gallery, their son growing sleepy against Alina's shoulder, the candlelight flickering softly across the portrait of the woman whose long-ago choice had set two families on a collision course that neither could have predicted would end in anything but ruin. Yet here they stood, proof that even the deepest wounds of pride and bitterness could heal, given enough patience, enough honesty, and enough willingness to choose each other freely, again and again, long after any wager or debt had been settled. Word of Merrick's downfall and the reforms Adrian and Alina had introduced across the estate had spread through the county over those 2 years, and Ravenshallow, once whispered about as a house of cold silence and old grudges, had become known instead for its fairness, its generosity toward tenants, and the unusual quiet partnership between its Duke and Duchess, who were seen everywhere together, reviewing accounts side by side, walking the fields discussing crop rotations, attending village gatherings not as distant nobility, but as neighbors genuinely invested in the well-being of those around them. Alina sometimes thought of the frightened young woman who had stood in a doorway at Blackmore Hall, listening to her own future being decided over a hand of cards, certain that whatever came next could only be a cage dressed up in silk and good manners. She barely recognized that woman now, not because she had changed so completely, but because she had finally been given the freedom to become fully herself, unburdened by her father's debts, unafraid to speak her mind, trusted as an equal partner by a husband who had learned, slowly and honestly, that love built on respect proved far stronger than any bond built on obligation alone. As autumn approached once more, bringing with it the anniversary of that stormy night which had begun everything, Adrian suggested they host a small gathering at Ravenshallow. Nothing grand, simply close friends and family sharing an evening together. Edmund arrived with news of his own recent engagement, laughing as he admitted that Aline's fierce independence had rather raised his standards for the kind of woman he hoped to marry himself. Her father arrived glowing with pride over his farm's autumn harvest, and even Mrs. Hargreave was persuaded, after much gentle insistence from Aline, to join them at the table rather than overseeing the meal from the kitchens, as she always insisted upon doing. Late in the evening, once the meal had ended and the younger guests had drifted into quiet conversation near the fire, Adrian caught Aline's eye across the room and inclined his head slightly toward the small card table set up near the window, a private joke between them that had never quite lost its meaning. Aline smiled and crossed the room to join him, settling into the chair across from her husband exactly as she had on their wedding night, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. "One hand," Adrian said, shuffling the deck with the same calm, unhurried confidence he had carried into her father's study that first fateful night, though now it carried nothing but warmth and affection rather than cold necessity. "And what are we wagering this time?" Aline asked, arching an eyebrow with the playful confidence she had grown into over these past 2 years. "Nothing," Adrian said simply, setting the cards down and reaching instead for her hand across the small table. "I already won everything worth winning, the very night I thought I had made the most reckless mistake of my life. I have no interest in wagering for anything else, not when I already hold exactly what I want." Aline laced her fingers through his, the emerald ring catching the firelight between them, and thought, not for the first time, that whatever cruel twist of fate had brought them together across a gambling table in a desperate father's study, it had led, against every reasonable expectation, to something neither of them could have wagered for and won on purpose. It had simply happened, slowly and honestly, the way the truest things in life so often do, one small choice at a time, until neither of them could imagine any life that did not include the other standing steadily by their side.